Someone in your group is not like the others. They talk to people who are not there. They hear voices that no one else hears. Sometimes they laugh at nothing. Sometimes they sit in silence for hours, staring at something only they can see. They have moments of clarity where they seem perfectly normal, and they have moments where the world they live in is entirely different from the one you share. Your group is small, 20 people, maybe 30. You cannot afford to lose anyone, but this person cannot hunt. They cannot gather. They cannot watch the children reliably. They are a burden, a drain on the group's limited resources. What do? Do you cast them out to die? Do you leave them behind when the group moves? Do you let them starve? Or do you find a place for them? The answer from the archaeological record is not what most people expect. Ancient humans did not abandon their mentally ill. In many cases, they did the opposite. They cared for them. They integrated them. They may have even revered them. Let me start with the most famous case in paleoanthropology, the Neanderthal, known as Shanidar I. Shanidar I was an adult male Neanderthal who lived in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan approximately 50,000 to 70,000 years ago. His skeleton was discovered in Shanidar Cave during excavations led by Dr. Ralph Solecki from Columbia University in the 1950s. Shanidar I's bones tell a story of survival against impossible odds. He had a deformed right arm that had been amputated or severely damaged at the elbow. The bone had healed, but the arm was unusable. He had extensive arthritis in his lower back and legs. His right eye socket showed evidence of a healed fracture that would have left him partially blind. He also had hearing loss caused by bony growths in his ear canals. This man was blind in one eye. He was deaf. He could not use one arm. He could not walk without pain. And yet he lived to be approximately 40 to 50 years old. In Neanderthal terms, that is old age. How did he survive? He could not hunt. He could not gather. He could not defend himself. Someone in his group had to feed him. Someone had to protect him. Someone had to break his food into small pieces that he could eat with his one good arm. Someone had to guide him when his vision failed. Someone had to compensate for his deafness by facing him when they spoke. This care was not occasional. It was sustained for decades. The level of care required for Shanidar I to reach old age is comparable to what a modern nursing home provides. And it was provided by a group of Neanderthals who lived 60,000 years ago. Dr. Erik Trinkaus at Washington University, who conducted the most detailed analysis of Shanidar I's remains, concluded that the survival of this individual was evidence of compassion within the Neanderthal social system. Let me repeat that. Compassion within the Neanderthal social system. Neanderthals, the species that has been stereotyped as brutish, dim-witted cavemen, took care of a disabled, blind, deaf old man for decades. They did not abandon him. They did not kill him. They fed him, protected him, and kept him alive. Now, what does this tell us about how ancient humans treated mental illness? The Shanidar I case is about physical disability. But Dr. Lorna Tilley at the Australian National University has developed a framework called the Bioarchaeology of Care that extends beyond physical impairment. Tilley argues that the same archaeological methods used to identify care for physical disabilities can be applied to mental and cognitive conditions. The problem is that mental illness does not leave marks on bones. You cannot see schizophrenia in a skeleton. You cannot see depression in dental calculus. You cannot see PTSD in the shape of a skull. Mental illness is invisible in the archaeological record, but we can infer its presence from other evidence, and we can infer how it was treated from how other conditions were treated. Dr. Penny Spikins at the University of York has argued that compassion and care for vulnerable individuals was a key driver of human evolution. In her 2014 paper, The Prehistory of Compassion, Spikins showed that the capacity for empathy evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, and that groups who cared for their vulnerable members were more likely to survive. Spikins argues that compassion is not a recent invention. It is not a product of civilization or religion or philosophy. It is an evolved trait that has been part of the human lineage for at least as long as the Neanderthals. The care for Shanidar I is not an exception. It is evidence of a deep capacity for empathy. But let me now address the harder question. What about mental illness, specifically conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, or what we would today call psychosis? In modern hunter-gatherer societies, these conditions are treated differently than in industrial societies. The Juhoansi-san of the Kalahari have a concept they call star sickness, a condition where a person is said to have been shot by a star. The symptoms include confusion, disorientation, and behavioral changes. The San do not interpret this as a medical condition. They interpret it as a spiritual problem that requires a spiritual solution. The solution is not medication. It is ritual. The afflicted person is brought to a healer, who enters a trance state and attempts to pull out the sickness. The community gathers around, singing and dancing, supporting the individual through the healing process. This is not unique to the San. Across hunter-gatherer societies, mental illness is commonly interpreted as a spiritual condition. The treatment is social and ritualistic. The person is not isolated. They are brought closer to the community. The illness is seen as a condition that affects the group, not just the individual. Dr. David Lewis Williams at the University of the Witwatersrand has spent decades studying the relationship between altered states of consciousness and prehistoric art. In his 2002 book, The Mind in the Cave, Lewis Williams argued that many of the most famous Paleolithic cave paintings were created by individuals in altered states of consciousness. These individuals, whom he identifies as shamans, were experiencing what we would call hallucinations. The key insight is this: what modern psychiatry calls a hallucination, many ancient societies called a vision. What we call delusion, they called prophecy. What we call psychosis, they called spiritual power. This does not mean that all mental illness was romanticized. Severe, debilitating mental conditions existed, and they were not easy to manage in a small group. But the response was not usually abandonment or execution. It was integration into a framework that gave the condition meaning. Let me talk about one of the most fascinating archaeological cases: the burial of Romito II. Romito II is a skeleton from a Paleolithic burial in southern Italy, dating to approximately 11,000 years ago. The individual was a dwarf. They had a form of dwarfism called achondroplasia, which causes short stature and distinctive skeletal features. Romito II was buried with elaborate grave goods. The burial included a deer antler and a necklace of marine shells. The body was placed in a flexed position in a grave that had been deliberately cut into the rock. This is not a casual disposal. This is a burial that shows respect, care, and social status. Dr. Paula Villa at the University of Colorado analyzed the Romito II burial and concluded that the individual was a full member of the community, despite their physical difference. The burial treatment suggests that they were valued, not marginalized. Romito II is not a case of mental illness, but it is a case of physical difference being integrated rather than rejected. It gives us a window into how ancient humans thought about difference itself. Now, let me go further back. The Cima de los Huesos site in Spain, dating to 430,000 years ago, contains the remains of at least 28 individuals. One of them, cranium 14, shows evidence of a severe developmental condition. The skull is abnormally small, suggesting a condition like microcephaly or a similar developmental disorder. Despite this condition, the individual survived to adolescence. They were not abandoned at birth. They were not killed. They were cared for through childhood and adolescence, despite a condition that would have made them dependent on others for their entire life. Dr. Juan Luis Arzuaga at Complutense University of Madrid, who led the excavation at Cima de los Huesos, has argued that this individual's survival is evidence of social care among the ancestors of Neanderthals. 430,000 years ago, a group of hominins cared for a severely disabled child. Let me now connect this to the question of mental illness. If ancient humans cared for the physically disabled, if they cared for the developmentally disabled, if they cared for the blind and deaf and lame, then it is reasonable to infer that they also cared for the mentally ill. But care does not mean they understood mental illness the way we do. Their understanding was shaped by their worldview, which was fundamentally different from ours. They did not have neuroscience. They did not have diagnostic categories. They had observation, intuition, and a framework that connected the visible world to an invisible one. In this framework, mental illness was not a brain disorder. It was a disruption in the relationship between the individual and the spiritual world. The treatment was not medication. It was ritual, community support, and sometimes physical intervention. Let me talk about trepanation. Trepanation is the practice of drilling a hole. It is one of the oldest surgical procedures known to humanity. Trepan skulls have been found at archaeological sites across the world, dating back to at least 7,000 years ago. Why did ancient humans drill holes in each other's skulls? The most common explanation is that they were trying to release evil spirits or relieve pressure on the brain. The practice is often associated with the treatment of mental illness, epilepsy, and severe headaches. Dr. Marie-Josée Bossy at the University of Montpellier studied trepan skulls from Neolithic France. She found that the individuals who received trepanation often survived the procedure. The bone around the hole showed signs of healing, indicating that the person lived for years after the surgery. This tells us something important. Trepanation was not a death sentence. It was a deliberate medical procedure that was performed on living people who were expected to survive. The survival rate was high enough that the practice continued for thousands of years. Was trepanation used for mental illness specifically? We cannot say for certain, but the association in many ancient cultures between mental disturbance and the need to open the head is well documented. Let me talk about shamanism. The shaman is one of the most important figures in human prehistory. Shamans are individuals who are believed to have access to the spirit world. They enter trance states, communicate with spirits, heal the sick, and guide the community in ritual. The fascinating thing about shamanism is that many shamans display behaviors that modern psychiatry would diagnose as mental illness. They experience auditory and visual hallucinations. They have dissociative episodes. They report being chosen by spirits. These are the classic symptoms of psychosis. But in shamanic cultures, these symptoms are not signs of illness. They are signs of calling. The person who hears voices is not crazy. They are being contacted by spirits. The person who has visions is not delusional. They are seeing the hidden world. Dr. Tem Hager at the University of Tübingen has argued that shamanism dates to the Upper Paleolithic, at least 30,000 years ago. The evidence includes cave paintings that depict human-animal hybrid figures, burials with objects associated with ritual practice, and the use of psychoactive plants. If Hager is right, then the role of the shaman may have been a social niche for individuals with certain psychological traits. The same traits that would have been disabling in one context became valuable in another. The voice hearer became the healer. The visionary became the guide. The person with altered consciousness became the one who could access hidden knowledge. This is not to romanticize mental illness. Severe mental illness is devastating regardless of cultural context, but it is to say that the way a society treats its mentally ill depends heavily on how that society interprets mental difference. In ancient hunter-gatherer societies, difference was not automatically rejection. The archaeological evidence consistently shows care for individuals with physical and developmental conditions. The ethnographic evidence shows that mental illness is often interpreted within a spiritual framework. that includes the person rather than isolating them. But there is another side to this story. Ancient humans also engaged in violence. There is evidence of cannibalism, warfare, and interpersonal violence throughout prehistory. Not everyone was treated with compassion. Some people were killed. Some were abandoned. The key question is not whether ancient humans ever harmed their mentally ill. It is whether they had a pattern of care that included them. The evidence suggests they did. Dr. Jill Pruetz at Iowa State University has documented care for disabled individuals among chimpanzees. In one case, a chimpanzee with a severe spinal injury was cared for by her group for months. The group adjusted their movement patterns to accommodate her. They waited for her when she fell behind. They shared food with her. If chimpanzees care for their disabled, then the capacity for such care has deep evolutionary roots. It predates humans. It predates Neanderthals. It goes back millions of years. So what does all of this tell us about how ancient humans treated the mentally ill? It tells us that they were probably not abandoned or killed as a matter of course. It tells us that care for the vulnerable is an ancient human trait. It tells us that mental difference was often reinterpreted within a spiritual framework that gave it meaning. And it tells us something about ourselves. The instinct to care for the vulnerable, even when it is costly, is deeply embedded in who we are. The psychiatric ward and the asylums are modern inventions. The shaman and the village healer are ancient. You carry the capacity for compassion that kept Shanidar I alive. You carry the social instinct that integrated Ramito II into the group. You carry the spiritual framework that gave meaning to voices and visions. Mental illness is not new. How we treat it is a choice. Your ancestors made that choice for hundreds of thousands of years. They chose to care. Let me add another case that pushes the evidence further back. The Dmanisi hominins from Georgia, dating to 1.77 million years ago. One of the skulls, Dmanisi skull 5, belonged to an individual who had lost all but one of their teeth before death. The tooth sockets show extensive bone remodeling, meaning this person lost their teeth years before they died. How did they eat? They could not chew. They could not process the tough foods that early humans ate. Someone in their group had to pre-chew their food for them, the way a mother bird feeds her chicks. Someone had to break down the food into a consistency they could swallow. This is care, and it is 1.77 million years old. If early humans provided this level of care for a toothless old person, they were certainly providing care for individuals with mental and cognitive conditions that made them unable to function independently. Now think about the case from the site of El Sidren in Spain. Among the Neanderthal remains at El Sidren, researchers found evidence of cannibalism. The bones had cut marks consistent with defleshing. This has been interpreted as evidence of violence and conflict, but a 2014 study led by Dr. Antonio Rosas at the National Museum of Natural Sciences in Madrid found something else. The El Sidren Neanderthals showed evidence of care for one individual who had suffered a severe cranial injury and survived. The skull showed signs of healing, meaning the person lived for months or years after the injury. This is the paradox of ancient human behavior. The same species that practiced cannibalism also practiced long-term care. The same groups that engaged in violence also showed compassion. Humans are not angels, but we are not monsters either. We are a species that has always done both, and the evidence shows that care was more common than violence. Let me now talk about something that the field of archaeology rarely discusses: the role of the mentally ill in creating art. The cave paintings at Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, and hundreds of other sites are among the greatest artistic achievements in human history. They show animals, hunting scenes, abstract patterns, and human-animal hybrid figures. The skill of the artists is undeniable. But who were these artists? Dr. Jean Clotz, former director of research at the French Ministry of Culture, spent decades studying the painted caves. He argued that many of the paintings were created by shamans, the human-animal hybrids, the geometric patterns, the placement of art in deep, dark, inaccessible parts of the caves. All of this points to ritual practices involving altered states of consciousness. The artists of the Paleolithic were not ordinary people in ordinary states of mind. They were individuals who could access different levels of consciousness. They may have been people who would today be diagnosed with conditions like bipolar disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, or dissociative identity disorder. This is a provocative idea, but it has support. The geometric patterns found in Paleolithic caves are nearly identical to the geometric patterns that people report seeing in the early stages of a hallucination. These entoptic patterns, caused by the structure of the visual system itself, appear across cultures and across time. The same spirals, grids, and dots that appear in Paleolithic art appear in the art of shamanic cultures around the world. If the creators of Paleolithic art were individuals with unusual psychological traits, then mental difference was not just tolerated in ancient societies. It was productive, it was creative, it was valued. Now let me address a difficult question. Did ancient humans ever kill their mentally ill? The answer is yes, probably. Infanticide was practiced in many ancient societies for children with severe deformities. The Greek myth of Oedipus is a cultural memory of child abandonment, and there are archaeological cases such as the Lovers of Valdaro and other double burials that suggest violence against certain individuals. But we have to be careful with the evidence. The fact that some individuals were killed does not mean that killing was the standard response to mental illness. The standard response, based on the care evidence we have discussed, seems to have been care. Consider the cost of care. In a group of 20 people, supporting one disabled individual requires everyone else to work slightly harder. The hunter brings extra food. The gatherer collects extra plants. The firekeeper keeps the fire burning longer, so the disabled person stays warm. But the cost of abandoning that person is also high. You lose their knowledge. You lose their perspective. You lose the genetic diversity they carry. And you lose the social fabric that makes cooperation possible. A group that abandons its vulnerable members is a group that cannot trust each other. And trust is the foundation of human cooperation. Dr. Paul Pettitt at Durham University has argued that the development of social care was one of the defining features of human evolution. In his 2011 book, The Palaeolithic Origins of Human Burial, Pettitt showed that the treatment of the dead changed dramatically over time. Early hominins treated the dead as obstacles. Later, hominins treated them as objects of care. This transition from disposal to care is one of the most important developments in human history. The care for the mentally ill fits into this broader pattern. As humans evolved, they developed the capacity to see beyond immediate utility. A person who could not hunt was still valuable. A person who could not gather was still a person. The capacity for this kind of recognition is what makes humans different from other animals. Let me bring this back to you. You live in a world with psychiatric hospitals, medications, therapists, and support groups. You have a language for talking about mental health. You have categories and diagnoses and treatments. Your ancestors had none of this. They had the human capacity for care and the social structures to deliver it. The next time you hear someone described as mentally ill, remember Shanidar I. Remember Ramito II. Remember the individuals who painted Chauvet Cave. Remember that your ancestors cared for their vulnerable members for hundreds of thousands of years without the tools you have. They did not have the science. They had the instinct. You have both.